the Mules Rider Chronicles podcast, Episode 8, The Rooster, the Dog, and the Horse. Hello again, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Mules Rider Chronicles podcast. I am your host, Craig Marlette, the Mules Rider, and today I'm going to share a story about the time my normally law-abiding father decided to take things into his own hands and hang a chicken thief for his crimes, without even bothering to get a warrant. Thankfully, the alleged culprit did manage to survive that event with a little help from his friends, but it altered him forever, and to my knowledge, he never had a hankering for chicken again. So hop up here on my old mule, and let's go back in time as I share with you the story of the rooster, the dog, and the horse. I often wonder what my life would have been like had my father not passed away at such a young age. He was only 44 when he died, and I was 17. He was brought up in an age when men were expected to be tough, and the outward showing of affection by a man was sometimes considered weakness. Still, he was a kind man, and to the best of my remembrance, a loving father. I would have liked to have known him as an adult, and often think about what kind of a grandfather he might have been for my children. I can hardly remember him when he wasn't wearing a suit, and except for the ears, he looked a lot like Clark Gable. My father came from a hard background, as did many who were born during the Great Depression. He had always wanted to be a doctor or pharmacist when he grew up, but he never made it to college. His father wanted him to go to work right out of high school so he could contribute to the household income. By the time he got married, he felt that those opportunities had passed him by. So he went on with the business of being a husband and raising a family. For most of his life, he made his living in the automotive business. We moved a lot when I was growing up, so much so that some years back, while visiting my family in Michigan, I decided to take pictures of all the different houses where I'd lived when I was young. It's something my wife hates, though it seemed to have some therapeutic value to me. I even bought a special camera to do the job and get some good pictures to show my kids a little about my past. After I had them all developed, they looked more like one of those real estate books where they have all the houses pictured so you can see what's on the market. Lying side by side on the coffee table, they resembled a sizable housing development. The car business is feast or famine, and when things were good, we lived well. When they were not so good, we moved. Sometimes it seemed like we would have breakfast in one house and be in another for dinner. I guess some of that stuck with me for some time, as my wife often reminds me of how many times we relocated in the early part of our marriage. She says she could always tell when we were about to move. It was usually right after she finally hung the pictures on the walls from the last move. Apparently, some habits are harder to shake than others. Not that I really minded that much. I think it may have even played a big part in molding my personality into what I am today. I can pretty much get along in any situation and don't mind the challenges of starting over again with new friends and new surroundings. An acquaintance of mine was in the Green Beret during the Vietnam War, and he was a real Rambo type with quite an interesting collection of war stories. Apparently, they would drop him out of a helicopter or plane in the middle of nowhere late at night, and by himself he would have to take out enemy fortifications and find his own way back to camp after all the damage was done. I'm a bit like that, except if they dropped me off, I would probably make friends with all the natives, learn the entire history of everyone in the village, start a Don't Eat Your Neighbor 12-step group, deliver a pregnant woman's baby, cook a pancake breakfast for the whole tribe, and organize a yo-yo contest for the kids, all within the first 2 days. You might say I'm like a human Ronco Vegematic, versatile and pretty user-friendly. I guess I got that from my dad. Don't get me wrong, though. I'm not trying to paint a picture of my father that would indicate he was up for beatification in the Catholic Church or anything like that. He was just a good guy. He probably drank too much beer and smoked too many L&M cigarettes. Aside from that, the only other thing he did that was a bit risky was fighting gamecocks. My grandfather, my dad, and his brothers would bring fighting roosters down from Canada, and they would train and fight them in the barnyard cockfights that went on in Michigan from time to time. I grew up hearing a little about those days that were before my time, but there was one story that seemed to stick in my memory most of all, the legend of Old Baldy. Apparently, Old Baldy was the favorite champion fighting cock of Dad and Grandpa Marlette. A bandy rooster, which simply means he was a full-grown rooster but weighed less than 4 pounds. He had quite a reputation as a winner, meaning he was still alive after 2 years. Since most of the fights then were Balentia, or fight-to-the-death matches, surviving that long was a major accomplishment. Before gamecocks are trained to fight, they can be left together in large numbers in the pen because the toughest and biggest one, known as the cock of the walk, will keep them all in line and take care of any problems that might arise. When they are getting ready for training, it's necessary to cut off their wattles and combs, the fleshy parts above and hanging below their beak. When that is done, they can no longer recognize each other and will start fighting to establish dominance. In the case of old Baldy, this is how he got his name and reputation. After the cutting of wattles and combs in his group, he ended up in a fight with the cock of the walk, who tore all the skin off of the top of his head,
Hey, that hurts,
and left pretty much nothing but the brain. He managed to survive and eventually became tougher than nails and a great fighter. My Uncle Bob tells me old Baldy went to Pensacola, Florida with him, and actually won quite a few fights there before being returned back home to Dad and Grandpa Marlette. If you've never been to a cockfight, it's quite an amazing event. On the appointed day or night, all of the owners would bring their champions to a pre-designated location, carrying them in individual game bags that were usually made of linen, though some of the more high-rolling fighters used velvet bags as well. This is how they would move the cocks from pen to pen for their fights. The tricky part, of course, was the start of the match, where they would often hold them only inches apart until all bets were in and the signal was given, at which time the birds were released in midair and you got out of the way as quick as you could, hopefully without losing an eye or getting your arm mangled in the process. Not a sport for the timid, to be sure. And why would someone want to do such a stupid thing, one might ask? Money. The farmers and gamblers would come from far and wide with pockets full of money. As in all such things, gambling was at the heart of it all. Now, a rooster has a natural sharp claw on the back of his heel that is known as a spur. Sometimes they would fight naked spur style, which meant they used no artificial spurs. But more often the cocks would be fitted with additional metal spurs that would allow them to brutalize their opponent in a flurry of mid-air, high-speed kicking and thrashing. The odds of any given fighter surviving an extended season were about the same as a black man in 1950 hitchhiking through Mississippi with a blonde girlfriend. Most of what they called battle stags were under 2 years old. After that, they were pretty much ready for retirement if they lived. Old Baldy was a great fighter, and my father had a real affection for him, often telling my brothers and I how great a champion he was whenever we brought the subject up. He had fought many battles, but was still lucky and crafty enough to keep up with the youngsters when he should have retired. Still, as is inevitable in any sport like cockfighting, eventually your luck runs out. One night, in the heat of a ferocious battle, old Baldy took down his final opponent, and for his victory he paid the ultimate price. The owner of the defeated cock jumped into the ring in a fit of anger, grabbed old Baldy by the feet while he was still gloating in his moment of victory, and slit his throat with a sharp-bladed hunting knife. Old Baldy fought his last fight, and after that night Dad felt this was a fitting time to retire from the game himself. By the time we moved to Manawan, Michigan, my father had only one rooster left, a beautiful red, gold, and yellow fighter that ruled the chicken pen like Foghorn Leghorn.
Now, what's that skinny old hen doing up on the barn?
He was a high-strutting thing, and though he had never actually had to fight much because of my father's retirement, he walked around our chicken pen like a PBA bowling champ, returning to his small hometown for a benefit match. He was king of the roost, make no bones about it. It was a feasting season in the car business, and the house we rented was a beautiful 2-story brick home with a big fireplace in the living room, wood floors, and a huge kitchen with a large open dining area. Outside, the house was covered with vines and ivy, growing up the sides of the brick walls so that it resembled an old European-style country home like those you often see in travel films about England. There were 64 acres altogether, and a large part of the land was covered by a grape vineyard, which the owner kind of let go, probably after the Napa Valley was discovered and he realized the market for Michigan wine was going to be on the decline. Mostly it was a dry, sandy place where we would chase imaginary foxes and play hide-and-seek during the daytime. The rest was taken up by a beautiful 10-acre pasture where the owner's 2 horses, a black and white stallion, and a huge red Tennessee Walker grazed freely when my brothers and I weren't busy trying to lasso them and ride bareback. Behind the house there was a large work barn with several stalls for the horses, and, as I mentioned earlier, our chicken pen with Dad's retired fighting cock and about 15 laying hens, which we used for eggs and an occasional meal. I had a mutt dog that was a cross between some kind of shepherd and a basset hound, which made him low to the ground with an inherent need to herd any other animals that happened into the vicinity. His name was Rover. Rover didn't like the fact that he could sit within a few feet of the fat, plump chickens in the hen house, but he was never allowed beyond the wire fence to hone his herding skills and, of course, take advantage of the occasional light snack. Even if he could dig under that fence, that rooster would see him coming and head him off at the pass before he could get a good drool going.
I say that dog strictly G.I. Gibbering idiot, that is.
Poor Rover would sit outside that fence with his pea brain straining for some scientific method that would give him a chance at one of those fat, juicy buttercup hens. It never seemed to bother Dad that the dog carried on an endless vigil, looking for the right opportunity. I guess he figured that dumb old Rover wouldn't have a chance against a well-trained rooster. Never underestimate the determination of a hungry hound dog. It was about 2:30 on a weekday afternoon when Rover got his big break. After a heavy weekend of servicing the local gals in the hen house, our spoiled retiree thought it was safe to take a well-deserved hiatus from his duties and grab an afternoon siesta. I guess he was Mexican bred, and the old natural tendencies of his genetic history got the best of him. He dozed off in the afternoon sun, and Rover didn't lose a minute making his play. Under the fence he went, grabbing the first 2 plump chickens in his path, quickly establishing himself as a dog on a mission. By the time that rooster managed to come out of his nap, Rover was on him, and apparently, not knowing what to do in a sudden ground attack, and having hung up his spurs years before, he awoke just in time to find himself staring straight into the face of destiny. Rover grinned and quickly clamped his jaws down on the rooster's back and began shaking him like an old dust mop. He made quick work of his nemesis and secured what he now assumed was his own personal buffet, having no more interference from the rooster. Dad, like the old cockfighter that jumped into the pen with old Baldy years before, heard the ruckus in the chicken pen and came out of the house like a man with 3 legs. He quickly appraised the situation and ran to the barn to get a rope. About that time I was getting off my school bus, and in the distance I could see my dog swinging from a branch on the big oak tree out back. My father was yelling obscenities at man's best friend, while Mother was busy whacking Dad with a broom and pleading mercy for old Rover. Dad had taken hold of that dog and strung him up like a gunfighter caught in the act by Judge Roy Bean. Poor old Rover just hung there, still holding that dead rooster by the leg, twitching and twisting like a hula dancer on a bed of hot coals. He was willing to go to the grave rather than give up his greatest prize. By the time I got into the fray, my mother had calmed Dad down enough so that we could lower Rover off the tree and help him get back on all fours. He twitched for a while after that, with his head hanging distinctly to the left like Quasimodo, and his tongue about 3 inches longer than it was before. Like a reformed alcoholic, though, he never went back to that chicken pen for a taste. You could have given him a tambourine, and he would have made a great addition to any Salvation Army band. He was a convert for life, and chicken was never again on the menu at his house. Dad had the blues for a while and took a picture of that rooster down to the camera store to have them make an 8x10 for the wall in his den. When he died, he left the picture with my mother, who loaned it to me for this book, though it never held the same position in her heart that it did with my father. I learned something that day myself. You never know what it might take to make a man, even a good man, go over the precipice and find the Mr. High that lies just below the surface of all of us. Maybe it was just a flashback to another time when someone else jumped the fence and stole a hard-earned victory while Dad wasn't looking, or the anger and frustration of seeing his own life become less than he had hoped and planned for, all unleashed that day by the simple violations of a hungry chicken thief. Maybe that rooster was Dad's only living link to a time when he was wild and fancy-free, a man's man in a man's world. Or maybe he just wasn't about to let no Jesse James come into his town and shoot up the local citizenry. I guess I'll never know for sure. My father never told me what was on his mind that day. But I reckon sometimes we all just got to do what we got to do, and there ain't no need to try and explain it to no one. He couldn't hold on to the past any more than Rover could hold on to that old rooster after the hangman started collecting dues. When your life is hanging by a thin rope over a tree branch, you tend to prioritize and let go of everything that's not really essential for the moment. You may walk with a twitch for a while, but eventually your neck will straighten up and you'll be able to hold your head high again. We moved again soon after that, though I still remember the nice brick house with the grape vineyards, the horse pasture, and the chicken pen on the side of the barn. And I can still see that old oak tree where Rover hung that day, contemplating the second biggest decision of his short-lived career as a chicken thief. Life pretty much went back to normal, and the story of the rooster, the dog, and the horse faded off into the busyness of my life, until today when it came back to me so I could share it with you in this story. Wait a minute. Whatever happened to the horse? You didn't tell us about the horse. I'll save that for another story. I just like the title better with a horse in it. Well, that's all there is today, friends. I hope you enjoyed my story, in spite of the tense moments where justice almost failed my old friend Rover. But Dad, being the kind soul that he was, eventually the two of them patched up their friendship and went on the road as spokespersons for the RCLU, that's the Reformed Chicken Lovers Union, fighting for a ban on Jewish penicillin. They never made it up to the Supreme Court, but the local chickens named a hen house after them, and they are still celebrated annually for giving it their best effort. Now make sure you tell your friends about the podcast, and I hope to see you again next week. Until then, so long.